Okay, so I just want to give a brief overview, which is the same as the abstract for my talk. So a lot of people think of emotion as something that is clearly an aspect of humanity. It's something that makes us human. And in fact, some people think of emotion as an obvious proof, an obvious demonstration of an immaterial aspect to our human existence, something that is beyond just our material brains. But I want to ask the question, can we think of emotion, something as seemingly abstract as emotion, as an evolved characteristic in the same way that we think of more clearly, obviously evolved characteristics like strength and speed and physical prowess as evolved characteristics? So in this talk, I'm going to explore ways that we can consider emotion as an evolved mechanism. And I'm going to put emotion, the perception and the production of emotion, within this broader category of communication within a species, intraspecies communication. And finally, I'm going to present a little bit of evidence that possibly emotion and speech may have co-evolved and therefore share some of these resources in perception and production in the human brain. So the way I was inspired for this talk was because of my students. All right, so I teach introductory psychology fairly regularly. Most terms I teach introductory psychology. And I always give an assignment at the beginning of the course where I ask my students to tell me about their own philosophy, their own kind of beliefs about the way they work, about the way the universe works. I ask them to consider the nature of reality, and in particular, the nature of the human mind. Because I think everybody implicitly has these beliefs. They have their own opinion of the way things work, their own understanding of the way that the human brain works, the human mind works. But I want my students to consider that first so that they can then consider all of the things that I'm going to teach them in the length of the course of the different things we cover in intro psych. So first I talk about dualism, materialism, and immaterialism. And if you've had any kind of background in philosophy, you're familiar with these terms. So dualism is, I would venture to say, the most common philosophical viewpoint that people have, okay? And if you are a dualist, you think that humans and physical reality have two different aspects to them, okay? So if you're a dualist, right, two different aspects. You think that there's the physical reality that you see around you, that there is physically real substance, that we are made of a real physical body. But you also think that there's something immaterial to the universe and to humans in particular. So this could be something like a soul, okay? Many people believe in the existence of a soul that maybe goes to an afterlife, this kind of thing. Or even if you're not particularly religious and you don't have that kind of viewpoint, you might think that there's still is something immaterial about humans, something that can't fit into that category of the physical nature of us. You think that there's something immaterial about us. You think that maybe there's a mind or a spirit or an essence that perhaps leaves when we die, this kind of thing. And I would say that most people, in my experience, and I've asked at this point hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students this question, the vast majority of them will say that they believe in these two aspects of human existence and these two aspects of physical reality. Now, materialism is another viewpoint that you can take in which you say, well, there is no immaterial aspect to humanity. There's just the material aspect to humanity. And everything we think of as immaterial, things like the spirit, the soul, consciousness, these are products of our physically real body. These are products of the functioning of our brain. Okay, so we have this organ between our ears, this brain, and it does stuff in the same way that our other organs do stuff. Our liver is not just a slab of meat. Our heart's not just a slab of meat. Our heart beats, it pumps the blood around our body. Our liver, detoxifies our body. And our brain carries on these activities that create our reality, that create everything about us, a materialist would say. Now, immaterialists, that's the other possibility. And I've yet to meet a real immaterialist. But there was a guy named George Berkeley. He was a philosopher. in the 1700s, and he thought that physical reality was an illusion. There was no such thing as physical reality. He really believed this. He thought that, in fact, God was projecting an image into every single person's consciousness, and that physical reality was just an illusion put into our brains by God, and all there really was the immaterial essence of who we are. And sometimes my students will say they're immaterialists, but that's just because they weren't listening in class and don't know what it means. So one of the frequent comments that I get when people dismiss materialism, they say there's no possible way. This is what my students will say. There's no possible way materialism could be true because of things like emotion. It's one of the number one things they'll point to. They'll say, emotion can't possibly be the product of a material brain. It couldn't possibly be the activity of the brain that creates this powerful thing that are our emotions, our feelings of love, our feelings of hate, our feelings of anger, sadness, surprise. That there's no possible way that this could be produced by just the firing of some brain cells. It has to be something more. It has to be something given to us divinely, or something that's beyond the reach of anything we could know in science. And so I'll get frequently dualists who are very dismissive of materialists, and they'll say, there's no possible way. There's no possible way. And Darwin thought about this a lot too, okay? My good old buddy Darwin, he thought about this a lot too. And at the time that Darwin was beginning to have his thoughts on emotion and really start to ponder it deeply, emotion was definitely viewed by the scientific community and by the public at large as a divinely created part of us. And I put up a picture from a book by a guy named Charles Bell. He wrote a book called Anatomy and Philosophy of Expression. So he wrote this in 1824. So this is just prior to when Darwin's really, get going on his voyage and starting to have all of his deep thoughts on evolution. And he actually claimed in this book in 1824 that the muscles in our body, so in our face and in our vocal tract, that produce emotion are divinely created, okay? That our feelings are uniquely human. Humans are the only people, the only beings on the earth who get emotions. They're unique to humans, and they're divinely created. And this musculature was given to us by this creator so that we could express these emotions, these things that we uniquely have. His little quote that he said at the time was, "Expression is to the passions as language is to thought." Okay, and again, the assumption is that language is also something that makes us uniquely human and something that has been divinely given to us. So language and emotion are two things it's just assumed, as a lot of my students assume. It must be something that is given to us by this immaterial nature, this immaterial part of us. Okay, so Darwin started to speculate, though. He started to think that emotion was an evolved mechanism. And he said, when I look at animals, I really see emotion in the animals too. I think this is something that we actually might share with animals. And he kept a little book called the M Journal, okay? Or M Notebook, the M Notebook, okay? And it was called the M Notebook. M stood for metaphysical. And this was all Darwin's writings about things that didn't really fit into the category of biology, or didn't apparently fit into the category of biology. So he would write about things that were particularly relevant to psychology and philosophy in this little notebook. And he kept very detailed records of his own observations. Darwin was very famous for this. And so he kept very detailed records of his own children, of things that he saw in animals. And after a while, so he's writing in the M Notebook in the 1830s, so around 1838 he's writing about this. So, almost 15 years after Bell is publishing his book. And Origin, his book on the origin of species, the big famous one that everybody knows, comes out in 1859. And then in 1872, he writes this book called The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. And here he's going to finally really put forward what he's been writing in his little M Notebook all this time. He's really going to say, hey, wow, I think emotion is something that may be an evolved mechanism. Okay, so Darwin's going to put this out there. And the book had these wonderful illustrations in it. These are actually illustrations from the book. So he's got, a dog in kind of an angry or maybe submissive position, and then he would have these beautiful illustrations of apes and of people too, and there were photographs as well. And he really ticked off his publisher because they said, "You're going to cut into our profits with all these pictures," but he said, "I want them anyways." Okay, so he put this book out there, and it actually was really well received. Something like 7,000 copies sold out at the initial printing. It was really well received. And you might think it wouldn't be in Victorian era, when people are very, very conservative. And the way he did this was very clever. Darwin was very clever. In the book, he was sure not to compare humans to animals. He was sure not to say, "Look at how humans are like animals." Instead, he said, "Look at how animals are like humans." He would say, "Look at the little dog, it's making an expression just like a person. Look at the monkey making an expression just like the person. Look at the ape making an expression just like a person." Okay? And people thought that this was cute. It was well received. But of course, it's causing people to question things. So you got to read between the lines with Darwin too. Okay, so let's bring this up to modern day and talk about theories on emotion nowadays. So when theorists nowadays think about why we have emotion, why do we have emotion? What's the purpose of it? They'll say, well, we have an environment that's full of information. You look out into the environment, there's all kinds of information. There's visual information, the stuff you see. There's auditory information, the stuff you hear. There's the things you feel, your somatosensory information. There's all kinds of information. And some of it is important, and some of it is not as important. And emotion theorists will say that emotion is a signal to prioritize information, incoming information, okay? So, for example, let's say you're in the environment of evolutionary adaptation. So you're out there pre-civilization, but you're in your little band, your little group of people, and there's a tiger or a lion going to attack one of your friends or family members. You would shout to them, you would get emotional expression, you would say, "Look out, watch out for that. Oh my gosh, there's a lion right over there." Rather than, "Excuse me, there's a lion, he's about to attack you. I think you should pay attention to that now," okay? So these kinds of expressions signal urgency. They can signal urgency. They say, "Hey, this is something that's really important, really key for you to pay attention to right now." And indeed, emotion absolutely gets that reaction from us. When somebody expresses something with a great deal of emotion, it can catch our attention instantly. Our brains prioritize that information. They say that's really important, okay? So this is something that we need to prioritize. And emotion theorists will also say nowadays that emotion, the perception of emotion, and the production of emotion, so your ability to understand emotion in others, as well as your ability to produce emotion yourself, is at least to some extent universal. There's a famous researcher named Paul Ekman, and he came up with all these different faces that he said are universally understood. These different facial expressions, he says, are universally understood. And he went to all different cultures, and he said people from all different cultures can perceive surprise and anger and happiness and these kinds of basic human emotions. It's controversial now. Some emotion researchers will say it's not that simple, but to some more or less extent, all emotion researchers will agree that people universally can at least perceive positive emotion and negative emotion. So it's universal. Even if you don't understand somebody's language, if they're screaming at you in fear, you usually know, hey, I should probably pay attention and figure out what's going on here. And then importantly, emotion theorists say that emotion is processed distinctly from other forms of information, and even forms of information that are produced by similar mechanisms. So they'll say emotion in the face is perceived separately from identity in the face. And that seems obvious. You can see somebody's identity in their face, who they are, separately from whether they're happy or sad or angry. Okay? And you can perceive that separately from the speech content of what they're saying. So if somebody is just saying words, you can understand the words they're saying, you can understand the feeling behind it, and you can understand who's saying it. So theorists who study emotion will say these are discrete aspects of perception. So let's think, though, about emotion. Let's consider emotion as an evolved mechanism. What might cause us to think emotion might be an evolved mechanism? Well, first, as we said, emotion expression is seen in humans and animals. So the fact that we see emotional expressions of fear, expressions of anger, or something like that, expressions of contentment or happiness or something like that in animals, indicates that maybe it's not just an aspect of an immaterial soul that's unique to humans. Maybe this is something a little bit broader than that. Also, you have to think, if you really consider it, that emotion information being prioritized in our perceptual systems would be really good for our survival and our reproduction. All right, both to communicate, hey, look, there's danger, or hey, I'm angry, so that you can be prepared for a fight, you can be prepared to flee, you can have these kinds of defense mechanisms. But also, it would be really advantageous in social situations. So in situations where getting along would be important to survival and reproduction. You know, you want to know which other animal is willing to mate with you. And so they're going to show you certain signals, certain communication signals that say, hey, I like you, you're cool, let's mate. Or how about allies? How about friends? You know, you are somebody who, you gave me an apple yesterday, today I'll give you back a piece of meat and we'll exchange like this. I'm imagining some chimpanzees exchanging food. And that tells you who your friends are. Okay, so these subtle communication signals can really help your survival and your reproduction in an animal and in a human too. And of course, as our brains are getting ever more complex and our social systems are getting ever more complex, the ability to detect ever more subtle emotional cues can give us more and more of an advantage in our environment. And finally, we know now, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, that there are distinct brain areas involved in processing emotion. There are very real, very physically measurable circuits in the brain, patterns of activity in the brain that correlate with our emotional experience. So one of the first proposals for emotion in the brain and the circuitry of emotion in the brain was that the limbic system was the neural basis of emotion in the brain. Okay, so the limbic system is, you know, people think of it as the lower brain. And even an animal like a crocodile or an alligator has a limbic system, okay? And of course, humans do too. All the mammals do. And a guy by the name of James Papez first speculated about this circuit in 1937, the Papez circuit, he called it. And what he was doing was, this was a time when people still got rabies, okay? And we didn't have good treatment, we didn't have good vaccinations for rabies to prevent, if you got bitten by a rabid animal, the person from getting rabies. And so he noticed that people who got rabies, before they died, over the course of the rabies, they would have intense aggression, intense displays of anger and aggression. And after the people died, he looked at their brains and he found that the limbic system was damaged. In particular, the hippocampus was damaged. And so he proposed this limbic system circuit based on the things that he saw degenerated as being important for emotion. It's a little more complex than that. You can take a brain and behavior class and find out more if you like. But we know nowadays, it's very commonly accepted that the activity of the amygdala is especially important for detecting emotions and when we're producing emotions too. So especially negative emotions. So our amygdala, the part of our brain, lights up on fMRI, becomes very active, okay, and we can detect it through MRI, fMRI, and EEG, those kinds of equipment. We can see that this part of the brain is very active when we're perceiving particularly negative emotions. So emotions of fear, and when we're producing them ourselves. Fear, surprise, anxiety, the amygdala is very active. We also know that there are higher areas of the brain, like the medial prefrontal cortex, the superior temporal sulcus, that will actually be active when we're receiving emotional information, regardless of the sensory modality from which we get that information, okay? So you can see emotion in somebody else's face with your eyes. You can hear emotion in somebody's voice with your ears. And there are parts of our brain that are active when we see things. You know, the back of our brain, our occipital lobe, is very active when we see things. And then when we hear things, our temporal lobe is very active, okay? And that's what we would expect. But we actually find that there's areas of the brain that are active just when we perceive emotion, and it doesn't matter whether we're hearing it or seeing it. These areas of the brain will still become very active. And so this circuitry in the brain is very highly interconnected. It would be, way simplistic to say, oh, there's one part of the brain that we see become extremely active on fMRI. We see it light up with activity when a person is perceiving an emotion. Okay, it's not like that. There's different areas that are active, whether it's positive emotion or negative emotion, and these circuitries are very complex and highly interconnected, but they're also reliable. We also see these same areas active in these same ways for these same kind of emotion from person to person to person. Okay, so that indicates that there is a real physical basis for emotion. It's not necessarily the product of something immaterial that we could never understand, that we could never measure through science. We can see through these kinds of measures your brain's activity in response to perceiving and producing emotion. And so there you have it. There you have the brain producing this thing that we think of as very abstract and impossible to pin down and higher than we could possibly think could be confined to the workings of this thing between our ears. So emotion is communication. Emotion is a form of communication. And we can say it's gestural in nature. What do I mean by that it's gestural in nature? Well, we make gestures with our face. I mean the movement of our muscles in our face. We make these facial gestures to suggest emotions. We have happy facial gestures and sad facial gestures and angry facial gestures. And we also have gestures of our vocal tract. So our voice box, our mouth, all of the parts of our body that produce speech and produce sound, okay, they are making certain gestures, certain activity of those muscles that produce emotion in our when we're talking, okay? So I can say something with a sad voice, or I can say something with a happy voice, or I can say something with an angry voice. And it's the movement of my vocal tract and my mouth that's determining whether what's coming out of my mouth sounds happy to you or sounds angry or sounds sad, right? These are gestures. And perception of emotion is automatic to at least some degree. You know when a person is shouting at you in anger. You don't have to really think about it for a while. Is he angry? I can't tell. If a person's sad and crying, you really don't have to think about it very long. You perceive their emotions right away, and the same for joy or surprise, etc. And interestingly, when you are perceiving emotion, the parts of your brain that are responsible for producing those emotions activates, okay? So consider that when you are perceiving somebody else having an emotion, the parts of your brain that would be active when you would produce that emotion are also active when you're just perceiving it, okay? So the way they've done this is they've had people, for instance, watch videos of other people being angry or happy or sad or what have you. And then they will secretly videotape these people as they're watching the movie. And they'll see their if it's a sad face, they'll see their little brow furrow. And if it's an angry face, they'll see their eyebrows kind of go this way. And they'll see the sadness on the mouth or the happiness on the mouth. They'll see these small motor movements. And you've probably experienced this yourself. You're in an emotional talk with somebody. Your friend is really, really sad. They're telling you about something terrible that happened to them. And you find yourself, really empathizing with your friend and, having this kind of response where you yourself are having activity of your muscles that would be involved as if the emotion was coming from you yourself. And that creates this feeling of empathy. And this system is called by some researchers, is speculated to be what they call a mirror neuron system, meaning when I see you do something, do an activity, my brain becomes active as if I'm doing it. And the way they first discovered it was in monkeys. They had a monkey who was, they were recording from an area of the brain that was active when the monkey was moving, okay? And they had this same recorder still turned on in the monkey's brain, okay, that for recording the activity of the neurons. And what happened was one of the researchers came in and went and picked up a peanut that the monkey was looking at, and the motor neurons, the part of their body that would be active as if they were reaching for the peanut, activated when they were just watching the researcher reach for the peanut. And so they said, oh my gosh, some people call them monkey see, monkey do neurons. They say there's a part of our brain that activates when we're perceiving other people's motions and emotions, the same as if we were doing them ourselves. And people have speculated that maybe this is important to development, okay? So maybe it's babies need to imitate, right? Babies need to imitate to learn. So when a baby sees you speaking or hears you speaking, they imitate you to learn how to speak the language. When a baby sees you having an emotional response to something, they might imitate that emotional response to learn the proper reactions that they should have in different situations. And so people have proposed that this circuitry is important to development, but they've also proposed that this circuitry would be important to perception, that by empathizing with another person, you are better able to understand them and therefore able to function more effectively, okay? You are better. You are better at survival and reproduction. You are better at doing the things that are important to being a human because your brain activity mimics what the other person is doing. So people spontaneously imitate emotional facial expressions. We've seen it in babies. You know, this has been known for decades and decades that if an adult makes a face at a baby, the baby often, even very young babies, will respond by making the same face. And we also know through those kinds of experiments I was talking about where they record the person watching another person have an emotion, that people will imitate these emotions spontaneously and automatically. What about in language? Now, you're going to see some parallels here, and this is obviously by design. In language, we know that language is gestural in nature, okay? So our mouths are making gestures, making movements, our voice box is making movements to make the sounds of words. And our face, all the musculature of our face needs to move to make the sounds of words. So there's gestures involved in speech communication as well. And perception of speech is automatic. You know, I'm sitting here talking to you and standing here talking to you, you're not having to consider every word I say and think of the meaning behind every word I say. You're automatically understanding the words that are coming out of my mouth. Okay, so we understand speech without particularly having to pay attention to it and puzzle it out every single time. It's an automatic process once you've learned a language. And the perception of speech involves activation of productive resources. Okay, so in the same way that they've done experiments where they found that you will have the similar production of emotion at the same time you're perceiving it in others, you also will have a similar production of speech, okay, when you're listening to others or perceiving others. So you may have had this experience yourself. You are talking to somebody who has an accent, okay? Or maybe you're even listening to a show with an accent, and where people have an accent, and you start to pick up their accent. Have you ever felt that? That you're there and you're listening to this person talk to you with an accent, and when you start to talk, you feel like you're kind of saying their accent a little. You're kind of maybe in some way subtly imitating their accent. Well, that's a common experience, and research has shown that people spontaneously imitate the acoustic pattern of words. So if I have experiments like this all the time where I have people come in, they listen to a person saying words, and I just ask them, hey, can you say that same word after that you hear that person say it. So the person says cabbage, and the person they're watching in the video says cabbage, and then the participant themselves says cabbage. And then you say, okay, camel, and then the person themselves says camel. And we find that people can tell which person was listening and speaking after which other person. You can pick out the right person that they were speaking after because they start to pick up parts of their the way that they speak. So their rate of speech, you'll start to mimic the other person's rate of speech. You'll start to mimic some of the words that other people will say. And you might see this happen in conversations. You might see two people, as they start talking to each other, they'll start talking more and more like each other over the course of a conversation. They'll start to have the same rate of speech. They'll start to be using the same words. You may even see them standing in the same position. Okay, so people are constantly imitating all of these aspects of the other person in conversational situations. And this seems to be automatic. But in the brain, researchers have said the perception of language and the perception of emotion are two different things. They call it a double dissociation. Okay, what does this mean? This means that people who have had damage to the right hemisphere of their brain will have problems perceiving emotion, but they're fine when they go to perceive speech. And vice versa. When people have damage to the left side of their brain, they'll have trouble with producing or understanding speech, but they'll have no trouble understanding or producing emotion. All right, so this is what the research has shown consistently. We call this neurophysiological evidence, evidence from the brain. And so emotion and language researchers have said, okay, well, these are two different things. If a person can get brain damage that makes it so that they can't understand speech, but they're perfectly fine when they understand emotion, and if we have a person who can get brain damage that damages their ability to understand emotion, but they're perfectly fine in understanding the content of your speech, then they must be two separate things. But I wonder, in my own research, if speech and emotion actually might share some processing. And there is some evidence to suggest that this might be the case. It may be the case that when we're looking at people with brain damage and saying emotion and language are two different things, it may be the case that maybe we're just not measuring it carefully enough. That if we really measured it carefully enough, we would see that people who have language damage also have emotion perception damage, and people who have emotion perception damage also have language perception damage. And some research shows that indeed this may be the case. So what they've done is researchers would do something like they would have a person saying a word that what we call the lexical content of the word is emotional. So this would be a word like happy, a word like funeral, a word like sick, a word like pain, okay? These all have emotional meaning in the word itself. And you can say that word either in a happy tone of voice or a sad tone of voice or what have you. So you can say funeral. You can say what would be a sad word in a really happy tone of voice. Yay, funeral. You can say what would be a really sad word in this happy tone of voice. You can say what would be a happy word in a sad tone of voice. You can say excited, or in an angry tone of voice, delighted, these kinds of things. So they can be incongruent in that way in terms of their meaning and the emotion behind the voice producing it. And people are worse at perceiving these words when they're in conflict. Okay, so you're slower to perceive a happy word when it's said in a sad tone of voice. You're faster to perceive a happy word when it's said in a happy tone of voice. Also, and this is interesting, hearing impaired people actually have impaired ability to detect emotion on other people's faces. Now, that's weird because hearing impaired people normally have better visual abilities than people who don't have hearing impairments. They have compensation. So imagine you have hearing impairment, and so you're better at seeing things. This is a common finding, except for emotion. Researchers have found that when hearing impaired people, because they spend so much time looking at other people's lips to get the speech aspect of what the other person is saying, they miss the emotion that is clearly communicated in the other person's face. And finally, when we ask normal hearing people to do lip reading tasks, we call it speech reading tasks, we find that if there's emotion in the lip read signal, okay, emotion in what they're seeing, that it impacts their performance. Similar to the first thing I talked about. So if the person is expressing something happy and they're saying it with a happy expression, and they're saying something that is happy with a happy expression, it improves people's ability to lip read. And if they say it in conflict, like they say something sad, but with a happy expression, it impairs people's ability to do that lip reading. So all these kinds of things got me to wondering, are these two things overlapping, the language and the emotion production? So, brings me to the type of research I do. Okay, so speech is not just something we hear, it's also something we see, okay? And you can think about this. If you're in a noisy environment and you're having a hard time hearing someone, if you look at their face, it's easier to understand their words because you're watching their mouth movements. Or if let's say you're listening to the television and the volume's kind of low, if you look at what the actor is saying on television, you look at their face producing the words, it's easier for you to understand. And there's a really cool way that we can show that visible speech actually affects heard speech, okay? So what you see when somebody's speaking actually influences what you hear, okay? So this is weird, and let me show you how this works. Okay, so first what I want you to do, I'm gonna play this, and what I want you to do is not look up here. So either close your eyes or look away, look to the side, look down, look up, look whatever, as I go and play this for you. Ba, ba, ba. What sound do you hear? Ba. Does everybody hear ba? Yes. Okay. Now watch the video and tell me what you hear. Ba, 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 ba. Is everybody hearing va or fa when they watch the video? Okay. The only thing that's coming into your ear hole is the sound ba, but what's coming into your eye hole is va or fa, okay? And so what's coming into your eyes is affecting what you hear. And this is an illusion called the McGurk effect. We call it a cross-modal illusion because it's coming from different modalities. The stuff that's coming from your visual modality is crossing with what's coming from your auditory modality and affecting it. And this doesn't just happen for ba and va, it happens for a lot of different sounds, ba and ga. If you hear ba but watch ga, you'll perceive something like da. And this is a well-known illusion to cross-modal researchers. And so it's something that I've tried to utilize in my own research. And so what I wanted to know is, can emotion influence cross-modal integration? Okay? So I used the McGurk effect to see if I put emotion in the stimuli, because these are perfect stimuli. It has a voice, it has a face, I can put emotion right in there. If I put emotion in those stimuli, is it going to affect that cross-modal integration process, okay? And so I could put emotion in the visual signal, in my face. I could put emotion in the auditory signal, in my voice. I could put it in both, and that looks something like this if it's in both. Ba, ba. This is angry Theresa. Ba. Okay, now don't look away, or close your eyes. Ba, ba, ba. Should be a clear ba. And now if you look at my face, ba, ba. Clear va, ba. But actually, I measured the strength of the McGurk effect by presenting these kind of stimuli, different versions of these stimuli, over and over again to people. And I measured the number of times that they perceived a McGurk effect, that it integrated, that they got a va instead of a ba, okay? Versus the number of times it didn't integrate, that all they heard was the ba, all they heard was the auditory signal. And I found that the stimuli that contained emotion integrated less often than the stimuli that did not contain emotion. Meaning, when you saw that neutral face that you first saw, you were more likely to report hearing va or fa than if you saw angry Theresa. That some of the time when you saw angry Theresa, you would say, it still just sounds like ba to me. So the strength of the McGurk effect, this is a cognitively impenetrable illusion, they say, okay? No matter how much you know about how the illusion works, you still fall for it every time, okay? But the strength of the McGurk effect was reduced by emotion. And so that says to me that emotion and speech processing have to share some resources. So I would like my students, and I would like you to consider the brain and all of its functions as evolved mechanisms. We know that areas of the brain are dedicated to certain types of processing, including speech processing and emotion processing. We know that this kind of processing, this ability to prioritize information can be important to survival and reproduction, getting away from danger quickly, responding to positive social cues in an appropriate way, can help us survive, can help us reproduce. And so I propose to my introductory psychology students and to you that brain functions are subject to evolution, every bit as much as the other things that seem so much more obviously subject to evolution: speed, strength, and physical weaponry like teeth and horns and claws. All right, thank you.